Welcome to the Upstate Interview Series. I'm Luke Perry, and today my guest is Dr. Chris Riddle, Chair of Philosophy and author of several books, most recently From Disability Theory to Practice, published by Lexington in 2018. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Chris is a scholar of disabilities, and I asked him to the program to talk a little bit about his current research on the complexities of how people are vulnerable during the COVID pandemic. Now, most people think of vulnerability in regards to physical harm, but Chris's research has illuminated how it's more complicated than that. And his particular focus is on people with disabilities. Chris, can you share a little bit about your research in this regard?
Thanks. Yeah. So we heard a lot about vulnerable populations, both to start with, sort of in terms of who's most likely to be adversely affected during public health crises, like the one that we're facing now, as well as the prioritization of vaccination, perhaps even care more generally for what's perceived to be vulnerable populations. And sort of as you alluded to, people tend to think of this in terms of physical vulnerability. The most obvious example that emerges is age that corresponds with COVID-19. We think that people who are a little bit older tend to be more vulnerable here. And I call this kind of vulnerability person vulnerability, or vulnerability that is more likely to adversely impact the person of an individual, or the physical well-being. And I think, yeah, this is true of people who are older. I think it's also true of many people with disabilities, but perhaps not necessarily for the reasons that we think. A lot of people with disabilities may very well have corresponding health conditions associated with that disability that make them person vulnerable. Being immunocompromised, for example, having other comorbidities that can adversely affect their health. But I think there are other things that are concerning about the experience of disability and how that might impact vulnerability during public health crises. So if we consider, for example, the inaccessible built environment around us, the fact that a lot of people with disabilities might not have access to the physical hygiene facilities that a lot of people without mobility impairments might have access to. When we consider the oftentimes inaccessible way with which information is shared, we think that perhaps some people with disabilities might be more vulnerable as a result of not having access to up-to-date information about what's going on with the pandemic. We saw how quickly things change and things move here. It's difficult for people without disabilities to avoid touching common surfaces. But for a lot of people with disabilities who may require assistive devices, there seems to be an inability to avoid interacting with a lot of common surfaces that could potentially result in a greater vulnerability to the transmission of disease or illness. And finally, you've got people who rely upon caregivers. And oftentimes these caregivers work with multiple clients in multiple homes. So the ability to socially distance might be reduced for some people who might be in a position to require care in that way. So that's the first kind of way that I expand upon the notion of vulnerability that I talk about. It's not necessarily solely individualistic or physical attributes associated with an individual. It can be a lot of socially derived things as well. And then I talk about personhood vulnerability as well. Is that something that I should continue with here? I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Sure. I think this dynamic between person and personhood in your research is quite interesting. And perhaps in talking about that, you can tie in what you see to be the role for institutions, particularly what does it mean for government and its response to the pandemic to consider both a person in terms of physical well-being, as well as this concept of personhood that you've developed.
Sure, yeah. So in addition to expanding in this person vulnerability way, I talk about personhood vulnerability. And I suggest that Not all of us are equally at risk for having our status as valuable members of society taken away from us. I think there are some people that are at greater risk of being socially devalued than others. And I think people with disabilities perhaps represent a subset of these individuals that are personhood vulnerability, that we're at risk of saying that these individuals' lives are somehow less valuable than other individuals. And I think that this is a remarkable way of expanding this notion of vulnerability beyond mere person affecting vulnerability. And so to continue with this sort of appropriate government response, or perhaps even to start with how the government has fueled increasing this vulnerability. In the first two of my books, I argue that foundational to any just distribution within a government is the social basis of self-respect, the ability to live a life worthy of human dignity. That this is a prerequisite to all opportunities, goods, resources, provisions that we might provide to someone under any other notion of justice. Dignity is first and foremost here, and we ought to be promoting this through the policy that we enact. And I also talk about health a good deal, and I suggest that health has special moral importance, perhaps because of what it means to live in ill health. So this notion of dignity plays in directly to person vulnerability, to suggest that the government has an obligation to provide the resources necessary to live a healthy life, to live a life free from person vulnerability, as free as possible, but also to be free from personhood vulnerability. And I think we saw sort of remarkably damaging things happening at an institutional and sort of just social level emerge during this, when we have government officials saying the cure cannot be worse than the problem itself. That says something remarkably damaging, and it says something from a privileged position. And that privileged position is generally with reference to opening up the economy. That statement was made. And the privileged position is suggesting that one ought to be willing to undertake risk to reopen the economy. And that cost is not necessarily borne by that individual who's taking that risk, that they are not necessarily person vulnerable, nor are they personhood vulnerable. But what it suggests about the people who are person vulnerable, who might be harmed as a result of opening up this economy, is that their lives might be less worth living, that we ought not to concern ourselves with these sorts of things. And we see this again when we talk about reassurances that we ought not to worry about the transmission of illness because it's only killing population X, Y, or Z. Or when people refuse to wear masks because they think, I'm young and healthy, I need not really worry about this. Well, the implication there, of course, is that there are other people affected by this, but that we ought not to be concerned about this because our autonomy or our freedom or our well-being more generally is perhaps more important than that. And I think all of these institutional responses really, really increase the personhood vulnerability of a lot of people with disabilities, the elderly, a lot of people with other illnesses.
So very interesting. I think you certainly illuminate a serious problem over the last year in terms of the government's response and rhetoric to this crisis. At the same time, when you talk about self-respect and dignity, obviously there's a variety of different perspectives and considerations that you can take into account. And your focus, of course, is health and people with disabilities. How would you respond to those who think about those concepts, self-respect and dignity, and are small business owners or even workers, and they want to pursue the vocation, they want to work and assume that risk because that's part of how they understand what they are passionate about doing, as well as ensuring their material well-being?
Yeah, that's a great question, and so I appreciate you pushing me on this. I think I have two responses, and the first one might be unsatisfactory, so I'll attempt to shore that one up with the second one. But so the first one is, I think part of what contributes to personhood vulnerability is the fact that we tend to make rather holistic assumptions about people on the basis of one attribute associated with them. And so, in the instances of people with disabilities and whether their lives are worth living, or whether they deserve equal moral respect or something like that, I think we take one attribute, the fact that they have an impairment, and we make a holistic judgment about their overall value here. And I think that is what's vulnerable, and that is what's particularly damaging to this notion of dignity that we want to promote within a just society. And I would argue, perhaps unsatisfactorily, that when it comes to things like dignity associated with gainful employment, with being able to run one's business, that absolutely applies. But we tend not to make holistic judgments of individuals in the same sort of way. We tend not to affect their personhood in as holistic of a manner when an individual is unable to be employed in the sort of way that they think. So again, one might push me on that because, quite frankly, a large part of my identity is my role as a professor, and if I lost this role, it would be remarkably damaging to me. So the second response, then, that I hope becomes more satisfactory, is I think there are ways of solving that and assuring that dignity vis-a-vis just redistributive schemes and assistive policies to provide the necessary means for individuals to maintain a dignified life while continuing to operate society in a safe way for everyone within it. We can redistribute resources in a way that helps those individuals in a dignified manner. And I don't think that such a thing is, that such a remedy is as readily available to preserve the dignity of people with disabilities that we adversely impact or put at risk or make vulnerable as a result of making the sorts of assumptions that we made earlier about their value in society. So a problem, certainly, no doubt, but I think that there is an easier remedy, and I think it need not be as damaging as what we talked about before. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let's talk a little bit more about something you referenced before, political rhetoric employed by elected officials. And I'm interested in your thoughts on the importance of language here in navigating this crisis. You identified some examples of particular concerns. Are there other concerns you have in regards to how language has been used here? And also, I wondered if you could speak to some areas for improvement. If we think prescriptively based on your scholarship, what can elected officials now take away from what we've learned and do things better?
Good. Yeah. I think first and foremost, the rhetoric that's been employed surrounding who is at risk makes it appear as if people with disabilities are this minority group of individuals that we ought not to be concerned about. And I can understand in one way, because of course that rhetoric's designed to calm the public and to make us be at ease, which has the indirect effect, or perhaps direct effect, of causing panic amongst those who don't reside within that other category. But the World Health Organization estimates that there's around 1 billion people in the world with a disability. That's ballpark 14% of the world's population, 200 million of which experience limitations in daily functioning, right? Like, this is not a small subset of the population. So let's first change the way that we talk about the vulnerability that we're willingly introducing through policy, and stop pretending that it only adversely impacts a small percentage of the population. It's a very large percentage of the population. And also, for what it's worth, we will all become disabled, likely, if we're lucky enough to live long enough. This is not a us versus them or a binary sort of thing. This experience resides on a continuum, right? So I think that's the first way in which we need to change the rhetoric regarding this. And the second is the implicit suggesting that we are not of all equal moral worth or concern. It's suggested that we ought not to be concerned about a particular subset of the population because they are small. As I just said, they're not necessarily small. But this ignores a good deal of our sort of fundamental principled commitments here to suggest that we are of all equal moral worth. Everyone has a right to avoid person and personhood vulnerability. And we need to start changing the rhetoric that we employ to focus on equality rather than priority here, acknowledging, of course, that there's some necessary triaging that needs to happen.
What do you think explains that disconnect? I mean, it seems to me that the rhetoric you're discussing suggests a lack of recognition or understanding of the prevalence of people with disabilities, but at the same time, presumably all elected officials, either personally or in terms of their family, friends, know people in that situation. Yet, it seems like what you're saying is that in the rhetoric they use, they're not recognizing that. Do you have any thoughts on sort of why that is? Is that strategic? Is it lack of understanding or consideration of the extent of this issue? How do you begin to make sense of that?
Yeah, so I'm not a very strategic individual in life, and I'm not a government professor, so I'm reluctant to say that it's strategic. But the thing that I'll say is that it's a misperception, right? Like, people tend to perceive disability as a tragic experience to be avoided. And of course, we don't want to necessarily cause disability, but it's the strong emphasis on the medical model that disability is a personal tragedy, right? That it's a decrement in an individual that exists, that I think people refuse to acknowledge the prevalence of it. But if we shift to acknowledge that a good deal of impairments that individuals experience can be totally minimized simply through changing attitudes, physical, legal barriers, right? We can drastically improve the lives of people with disabilities, drastically decrease the personhood vulnerability that people face. But so to answer the question more directly and more succinctly, I think the problem is this focus on the medicalization of disability and the refusal to acknowledge that it's perhaps obviously a complex interaction between traits inherent to the individual and how they manifest themselves socially.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I can't help but also think of perhaps some of the cultural undertones and influences. I mean, death, for instance, is not something that our culture is particularly comfortable talking about. And so there could be some parallels there as well. Well, as President Biden has said of late, there's a hope, the target date of a significant expansion of access to the vaccine by July, and the suggestion that there'll be some return to normalcy beginning then, hopefully. So our society, many other societies, has been through so much over the last year with this global pandemic, and I think we're just beginning to imagine what the lasting influences and implications are going to be beyond that. So I wondered if you had any preliminary thoughts about rhetoric, institutions, this issue as our society slowly begins to transition out of this crisis.
Yeah, I think one thing that's changed that's been, I think, remarkably positive for everyone, but perhaps as well for the understanding of what it means to live with a disability, that I hope persists, that I hope we don't lose. And despite all the seemingly sort of negative things that I've been talking about, is an increase in the recognition of caring for one another. And that can take very, very modest forms of just simply listening to someone. But I think we've begun to recognize the importance that care serves in our community, And perhaps more broadly, the fact that we are all not individualistic and self-governing and able to get through without the care of others. And I think as soon as we stop regarding ourselves as these individuals who can do things without any other intervention or assistance or care, then we can start to understand what the experience of disability is all about. We look at people with disabilities and tend to think that they require an exorbitant amount of care and they're unlike people without disabilities. But I hope if this has revealed anything, it's that we're all remarkably dependent. And there's nothing bad about that. And as a result of that, we should all be remarkably willing to offer assistance to others and to receive it from others.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Chris Riddle.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching the Upstate Interview Series. For more, you could go to ucpublicaffairs.com.